So here we have the Range Rover L405, that's the model manufactured from 2012 onwards, and it has a fault seemingly in the front suspension where it's emanating noise from the driver's side, that's the right hand side of the vehicle. The noise could be described as a knocking, perhaps a clunking, or even a rattle. It's prevalent when driving on any unmetalled roads or potholed roads. Now, I was able to diagnose particular components were causing this and repair them at home in a modest garage, and I'd like to share that video with you in the hope it can be of some help. Well, I might save a lot of time by having a look at other Land Rover owners, Range Rover owners, before we get underneath the car. Obviously, we have to exclude some of the most common reasons for knocking sounds, maybe a golf ball in the glove box or a loose wheel nut, and anything obvious hanging off the vehicle. After that, it appears the L405, a failure point is of course the air spring itself and the damper. From what I read in the forums, the internet, and speaking to colleagues, this is actually very rare to fail, thankfully, because this is an extremely expensive item, and therefore I'm going to put that at the bottom of my list of things to do. A much more common failure point is what is called the anti-roll bar drop link, and you can see that it's number 7 on the bottom right hand side of that diagram. These are links which have got a ball joint on each side and hold the anti-roll bar, you can see there, number 6, to the chassis of the vehicle. They can fail and cause a rattling noise. It's not the case in my vehicle. I've already checked that in my vehicle. There are other videos on the internet about how to test replace an anti-roll bar drop link. Now, if you put your head underneath very carefully, behind the wheel and underneath the Range Rover L405, and look upwards in the front wheel arch, you'll see this is called the upper arm. So this is a front suspension upper arm. This can fail as well, but again, my reading is this is actually less likely to fail than other components. It takes a little bit less of the strain because it's holding the upper part of the air spring. Now, in contrast, the lower arms take an enormous amount of weight of the vehicle. They connect the chassis to the hub of the vehicle. There are 2 lower arms, so it's front suspension, rear lower arm, that's the one on the right there, number 8, and front suspension, front lower arm, that's the one on the left, number 3. And from all of my study of across the forums and the internet, the ball joints in particular, number 10 and 13 in that diagram, are very likely failure points. The vehicle in question has done 72,000 miles. This is a priori, especially given the anti-roll bar drop links have already been tested. 10 and 13, the ball joints, are the most likely failure points. What is done in practice, they are not pressed out and replaced. You replace both arms in their entirety. So armed with that information, I've attached a GoPro camera very firmly inside the wheel arch of the car so we can look down at the lower arms. That is the rear lower arm ball joint I'm pointing at. Just above it is the front lower arm ball joint, and you can see the half shaft moving. What we're looking for, and what I was looking for very closely on the video, was any slackness in these joints, any movement which wasn't predicted. And in fact, you can see it right there. I'm going to slow down that and show it for you, just as drive is being taken up. So if you keep your eye on the front lower arm ball joint, which is the one highlighted in the white circle there, watch very closely. Just as drive, there it is, just as drive is being taken up, there's movement which you really shouldn't see. See the ball joint is actually moving within the bushing there. That's the clunk that's occurring right there. So let's take a closer look at the static suspension here. There's the front lower arm. We saw the movement in that, likely causing the clunk, but also the rear lower arm here. We can see the end ball joint in the hub. And as you can see, that gaiter is visibly deteriorated. In fact, it's almost liquefied, it's split, and there's a lot of grease around. So both the front lower arm and the rear lower arm, you don't tend to press out the ball joints. The idea would be to replace the units completely. Are the diagnosis. And in fact, they did turn out to be the cause of the clunking. Almost all the clunking was removed by replacing the rear lower arm alone, and then it was completely eliminated when I also replaced the front lower arm. But before I chose to replace them, I did go through a little bit of almost a business case, effectively, to establish if it was worth replacing them versus taking to the dealer. This is quite a challenging job for the home mechanic. If you had a large two-post lift and air tools, etc., perhaps it's easier, but it's certainly not easy, or wasn't easy for me in a fairly well-equipped home garage. Number of reasons for not doing it. First of all, the diagnosis might not be 100%. You could set about a major suspension change and still have a knocking noise, so really take that into account if you're deciding to do it. Clearly, in this case, I'm fairly sure that we've identified the problem. A specialist tool is required in order to get these ball joints out of the hub. It's a JLR tool. I'll address in a second how I managed to get that cheaply. But really, having done the job successfully, it took me a few hours. But one of the biggest problems was high torque bolts. These bolts are really torqued up. I mean, they're 300 Newton meters plus, several degrees. It's very difficult to remove these, and they're difficult to access. Not inaccessible really, but difficult to access. And if you want to get air guns onto them, they never undo torque like that. You need breaker bars, and you can't get the air guns in. You can't get the breaker bars in without extensions. It takes time. It's also a critical system, of course. This is the suspension. If you snap a bolt, or if you just can't get something back in, or if you don't do up a bolt tightly enough, this is your suspension. It's not going to be easy to take an L405, which has got its suspension halfway off, back to a dealer to try and get it fixed. And it's certainly not going to be nice if there's an accident. Make sure you take all of these into account if you decide you're going to do this job. Okay, so conversely, reasons to be cheerful. I did it, and I'm an amateur mechanic, and certainly even when I've recorded this, I did my research, and 2 others had done it on eBay before me, so thanks enormously to them. You inspired me for being able to have a go at this. It is possible. I did the rear lower arm first, and I did that 10 o'clock in the morning, finishing about 2 p.m. and had some lunch in between, so it's absolutely possible. You can buy the specialist tools. Obviously, you can go along and have a conversation with your Land Rover dealer if you really want to. You can go to eBay, which would be the norm, and most of them there are available from China at about £140–150 at mid-2023. I thought I'd try a little bit of an experiment and went to really the Chinese eBay, which is known as AliExpress. And as you can see there, that's actually cheaper. That's about £89 or something, including shipping and VAT and everything. I did that. Managed to get the tool shipped to me within 10 days actually for less than £80, and it worked perfectly well. And of course I can resell that on eBay, probably at a profit. The parts, if you are happy to use pattern parts, and by the way, both for AliExpress and for these guys, I am not paid a penny. I'm not recommending anything to anybody here. This is just what I would do. And you can get these arms for about £70 each. You can see at the top of the screen there is the rear arm, and the bottom of the screen is the front arm. That's £140 total for parts. So even if you do keep the tool forever, which is unlikely, you're still in there for less than a couple hundred quid really, and you're almost definitely going to be able to resell the tool. And you can get these bolts off. A good breaker bar, a good socket set, you can get it done. Okay, so let's begin with the lower arm replacement. We'll begin with the rear lower arm on the L405. Disable any deployable side running boards. Just hold down the button when you start the car. Retrieve, of course, chock the car, retrieve the lock nut hidden in the boot, loosen the wheel nuts prior to jacking. Use the safe jacking point. If you've got deployable side steps, it's on the hinge of the side step, and lower the vehicle safely onto a substantial axle stand, and make sure it's thoroughly safe before you remove the wheel. Now, the tools that you're going to require, mostly available in most garages. However, this first socket that's going to take off the nut of the ball joint must be 12 point. 6 point sockets won't fit on, and it's 36mm. I've got a ½ inch there. Now, the other 2 sockets can be 6 point, and they are 18 and 21. Both cases, the bolt is 18 and the nut is 21, and I've got deeper ones there as well. Selection of breaker bars, I ended up using a very large breaker bar. I'm not a particularly strong person, so I needed the breaker bars. And of course normal wrenches as well. Also spanners, again 21 and 18 for each side of the bolt, and that 1-inch spanner is actually for using on the specialist tool. You can see there extension bars, and also of course a torque wrench. A hammer is needed at the last moments to release the ball joint, and here of course is the JLR specialist tool. Now you're also going to require two jacks, a large jack for jacking up the car and a bottle jack to support the wheel hub when you disassemble the suspension. Axle stand, penetrant spray. The measuring tape there is to ensure the suspension's at the right height when you bolt up everything, and of course chocks for your own safety. Obviously I would spray every bolt with penetrant spray or release spray in the hope that that might make life bearable. You can see to the left hand side there the bolt that is a chassis. The one now in the centre of the screen I'll call a yoke, and of course there's one at the bottom as well, which you can see there in the new arm, obviously checking that the new arm looks like it's going to fit. You can see the new nut fit there. Now I like releasing each of these one at a time. Before I take any bolt out completely, I want to do each one at least a half turn, because I know that that way I know it's not going to all be a disaster. This one is the middle bolt, the yoke bolt. You can see I'm using a 250mm extension with a large breaker bar, and obviously once it starts loosening a little bit you need the socket on the other side. That's 18 on one side and 21 on the other, and that proved to be bearable. What was more difficult was the bolt that's in the chassis. I couldn't possibly get any sort of electric torque gun in there, and don't think I would have managed anyway. It was an agonising process, a breaker bar with a deep socket and a very short extension, and I'm afraid it was the business of just trying to get a few degrees of motion to allow me to undo that bolt very gradually. The nut at the bottom of the ball joint, the 36mm 12 points, actually remarkably straightforward with a good breaker bar. And then with everything loosened, I could start to remove these. Try and support, you can support the hub with your own strength but it's better to jack it up so that everything's supported as you remove all of the bolts. Having removed the retaining bolts for the arm, it's now time to break the seal of the ball joint itself. And as you can see from the manual there, it says at the top, loosen but do not remove the 12-point 36mm nut. Then once you've done that, apply the GLR special tool. You can see they're careful with the gaiter above. It doesn't really matter too much, you're going to remove that anyway. And then lower diagram there, you strike with a hammer. So you tension the tool as much as you can using a 1-inch spanner by hand, and then you impact on the bottom with a hammer to loosen it. Now, top tip, because I recommend you leave on the nut, be careful that you can actually separate the bolt. The nut has a tendency to retighten. Even if you loosen by a couple of turns, when you apply the tool, it's got a tendency to retighten. That way, of course, when you impact, you're not going to be able to really release the ball joint because it's still retained by the nut. Even if you do loosen the nut several turns and be sure that it's got a few millimeters clearance, when you strike the bottom with a hammer, it's not obvious that you've broken the seal. It doesn't suddenly break apart dramatically. All you've really done is free a millimeter or two of space because the nut is still there retaining the ball joint in place. So regularly check. It didn't take much tension or much impact at all for me to split that. I just had to be sure that I did actually check it to see that I had split it at all. So replacement is the reversal of removal, of course, largely, but a few top tips. The bush will only go into the chassis holding there from a horizontal position. You can't push it in from below or above, so you have to manhandle the hub to an extent. You have to wiggle it around. Try and avoid any pressure on the threads. You don't want to strip the threads or flatten them now. It's tough, don't do your back in, but by the combination of the bottle jack and manhandling, I was on my own able to get these bolts cleanly through the holes in both the centre yoke and the chassis holding points, and then it's relatively easy to just tighten them up. But not any more than hand tight is essential. The suspension is where it's normally going to be, 471 from hub centre to wheel arch, when you tighten these things. Otherwise the bushings are always in torsion. Now the ball joint nut goes on at 290, relatively easy. Short extension and a torque wrench followed by a breaker bar to do the 240-degree turn for the yoke bolt, relatively easy. I found this last one very difficult. This is the chassis bolt, 100 newton meters, then a full 360. Not sure I quite managed all of that. Sorry for my face being mosaicked. I'm not famous, and I certainly don't want to be. And that's this job completed. So moving on to replacing the front lower arm, this is an easier job. It took me about an hour, excluding raising the car, of course. You only have two bolts to remove, the ball joint and the chassis bolt. Excuse my background, by the way, it's changed. I had to reassemble the vehicle. Normally you do both arms at the same time. There's a chassis bolt, 21mm on the left and 18 on the right, and of course you check the new parts there. Notice I don't get a new nut with the ball joint here. Again, in preparation, making sure that the hub is supported. It's not actually supported this time, the rear arm does most of the support. There's the 21mm open-ended spanner is necessary on the left. Not every toolbox has that. And the 18mm on the right. I didn't need to remove the plastic front bumper. I was able to get the bolt out from the chassis mounting really relatively simply. And the same, it was a very big breaker bar required on very tight and deep. That's that 36mm 12-point spanner being used, wrench being used again. 3 Torx T30 bolts holding in a little protective plate there give me much better access to the ball joint, on which again I fix and bash lightly. Again, not too much pressure required to be able to remove the ball joint. Now, really quite tricky getting out. If you are doing them both at the same time, both arms, do them both at the same time, because it's quite difficult to get the front arm out. You can see here it was really badly broken. Again, if you can do both arms at the same time, I would, because now that the hub is in place again with the rear arm in place, it's actually quite difficult to get the front arm back in there. It's difficult to get it past that drive shaft. The technique I found was to angle the ball joint at 45 degrees to put it in, then push the arm towards the hub so the ball joint becomes 90 degrees and push it down. So it's a two-phase operation, in at 45 degrees and then down at 90. So a little bit of light tapping to help align the front of the arm with that bolt, make sure it goes through cleanly. Relatively easy just to draw the bolt up. 21mm on the right, open-ended spanner, 18mm on the left. Do not tighten all the way. You need to get the suspension into its normal position before you tighten. This is very, very tight, 100 Newton meters plus a 360. I used a long-handled ratchet, and the 18mm, try and get that as straight as possible. 290 Newton meters on the ball joint nut. I had to use the same ball joint nut as the last one because it didn't come with the new one, the pattern part. But that's it all back together again. It took me a further hour to do this further arm, and now I won't bore you with lots of footage, but I've examined it, of course, closely. There is absolutely no movement, and better still, it rides like a dream again, and doesn't make any noises. So in summary, you would normally do two sides, of course. That would be the sensible thing to do. Because you're going to have to do alignment in any case, and you're probably cheaper to buy the parts. But for the sake of argument, looking at one side alone, the parts, I will probably burn in hell, but I use pattern parts, £140. You pay your money, you take your chance with that. I'm happy to do it again in a couple of years' time if I need to. I'm netting out the tool, specialist tool. I'm sure I'll get at least 40 quid for it. If I sold it on eBay, to be honest, that's probably going to be a profit if I wanted to be. But let's say cautiously that cost me 40 quid, which I wouldn't have otherwise spent. And of course, the alignment in the local tire and exhaust is going to cost me 45 as well. In terms of time, excluding lunch for both arms, my first time doing this took probably a little bit over 4 hours. I'm sure it could be more efficient the next time or on the other side. So in summary, to repair both lower arms and therefore eliminate the knocking sound on an L405 Ranger, £225, 4 hours of work. Thanks again to those YouTubers who went before me that helped inspire me to do this job, and more than anything, I do hope that this video helps you overcome any problems that you have with your Range Rover of a similar nature.